Last July, he was sentenced to 28 years in federal prison. So, all of these adaptations that I talked about have some consequences. This oppositional identity and scapegoating clearly deflects personal responsibility and reduces your willingness and ability to cooperate with other groups. The hyper-unionization has its value, obviously, but it values perhaps the wrong things in today's economy. It values seniority and rigidity over entrepreneurship and adaptability. Segregation clearly intensifies interracial disparities, legitimizes prejudices, weakens public education, especially in the core. Political fragmentation intensifies these interjurisdictional financial disparities and makes regional planning virtually impossible. And of course, identity politics intensifies mistrust and fear and tolerance for public official mediocrity, if not downright incompetence and corruption. All of these adaptations lead to a situation that I call collective irrationality. Collective irrationality is defined as follows. Individuals make decisions which are perfectly rational from their standpoint. However, when everybody does the same thing, it frustrates everybody's efforts to gain this same outcome. That's what collective irrationality is. Now let me give you a homely example here. Suppose that I am hungry. I have that need for physical resources, and I see that there's a lake next door that's full of fish. So to fulfill my quest for physical respect, I fish as much as I want every day until my hunger is satisfied. That's perfectly rational as a personal adaptation. What if everybody else around that lake tries to fulfill their needs in the same way? You know what's going to happen. All the fish will be caught, nothing is left for breeding stock, and everybody pretty soon gets very hungry. That's the situation we're in Metro Detroit right now, except it's not quite so prosaic about fishing. Our collective irrationality frustrates our region's request for respect in three fundamental ways. First of all, it erodes our quality of life. It clearly erodes it most dramatically in the city of Detroit. That's where all the journalists come to take their ruined pornographic pictures. But I would argue that even the suburbs pay a price for this dysfunctional metropolitan area. It erodes their quality of life, and I'll be happy to expand on that if you'd like in the Q&A. The second dimension in which this hurts our region is that it reduces the region's economic competitiveness. We're creating a situation where part of the workforce is incredibly undereducated. We have horrendous rates of non-school attending, not completing high school. Functional illiteracy is out the roof, and therefore we can't imagine what that workforce is going to do in the 21st century to earn a living legally. Secondly, we have a reputation for a violent metropolitan area along race and class lines. That doesn't seem like a very attractive attribute to get footloose entrepreneurs and international capital to invest here compared to somebody else that's a little bit safer. And the last dimension in which we're frustrating ourselves is our region's sustainability. Here I'm talking about energy usage, carbon footprint, sustainability in every dimension. And to explain this, it's pretty simple. I have portrayed for you a metropolitan area whose land use patterns can best be described as a donut. A giant, low-density, mostly vacant hole in the middle, and a constantly expanding edge. Can you imagine a crazier form for a metropolitan area than a donut? Think of the infrastructure, energy, transportation, blah, blah, blah costs that kind of form imposes. Well, I'm talking to a bunch of planners. I'm not just going to call an egg rotten. I'm going to try to lay a fresh one. How would I fix it? Well, I have to say, as a preamble here, that I'm not naive. I'm not suggesting that what I'm going to propose is easy politics. In fact, I think I'd have to be Emperor of Michigan to get these things done in my lifetime. But if I were Emperor of Michigan, here's what I'd do. I'm starting by saying we're starting at the Michigan state level. We're not talking about city policy. We're talking about metro-wide, in fact, metro-wide, statewide policy that only can come out of Lansing, our state capital right now. The state government has to change the rules about how cities play various games. And I would say that the three major areas where the rules have to change are, first of all, where development is most profitable. Now the rules are clearly favoring greenfield suburban sites. The second area where we have to change the rules has to do with how local governments raise revenues. The rules today basically says a local government has to get most of its revenue by taxing people and property located within its borders, period. And the last area that has to change is where affordable housing is located. Right now, the rules for the market say, well, if the cheapest, most low-quality housing is all concentrated in the older parts of the city of Detroit, so be it. That's what the market says. As for the little dribs and drabs of affordable housing that we're putting in through low-income housing tax credits, the rules currently favor dramatically the reconcentration of those units in the poorest neighborhoods, thus reconcentrating poverty and the race-class segregation that we've already diagnosed. Those three kinds of rules have to change. What would I put in their place if I were the Emperor of Michigan? I would do a growth boundary. A Portland style, a Montgomery County, Maryland style growth boundary at the urban fringe, and force speculative new development to work within the existing footprint and reuse sites which have already been abandoned. Secondly, what I would do is resuscitate Michigan's revenue sharing plan. In 1971, the state of Michigan passed a revenue sharing plan, which essentially, by the state constitution, set aside a certain fraction of the state's sales tax revenue to be redistributed to its localities based on a formula. Unfortunately, that formula isn't favoring very much the neediest financial communities, but the other problem is that the real value of that state revenue sharing has been cut back by the legislature starting dramatically in 2000 and following ever since. Since 2000, the real inflation-adjusted value of revenue sharing funds coming from the state of Michigan to the city of Detroit has dropped 47%. And they blame Detroit for going bankrupt. The last rule I change is how affordable housing is distributed across geography. Here we need to have an inclusionary housing strategy. I don't have time to go into details, but if I were emperor, I would have things like inclusionary zoning for all new developments over a minimum scale, changing protected classes under the state's fair housing law so that sources of income, including Section 8 rental vouchers and welfare receipts and food stamps, does not disqualify you if a landlord says, I don't want to rent to you. Changing the formula for where low-income housing tax credit projects are incentivized would be a place to start. Well, what drives Detroit? I have tried to argue that if you want to understand this particular metropolitan area, you need to start from a psychological foundation and see what people want. I've argued that we, probably like people everywhere, want to obtain, retain, and expand physical, social, and psychological resources. What I've summarized as the quest for respect. I have then argued that our metropolitan area has systematically frustrated our quest for respect by its economic base, by its housing and neighborhood production system, and by its violent dialectical power struggles along race and class lines. I've next argued that we have responded to these frustrating foundations to our metropolitan area by individual adaptations and collective adaptations, oppositional identity formation and scapegoating, hyper-unionization, segregation, fragmentation, and identity politics. Finally, I've argued that, ironically and perversely, these adaptations, although they make sense. You can understand why people are doing that. You can't blame them for doing that, but when everybody does it, it leads to collective irrationality. And that has led to this dysfunctional metropolitan area that we have today. What should be done? I've argued that essentially the solution is a statewide one. Now, in principle, it could be the federal government, but at this point, I'm a little down on them, so I'm going to put my hope in Lansing. I know I'm holding it at hope by a slender thread, but at least it's better, I think, than the feds. I'm arguing that we need to change the rules in 3 basic areas: where development is most profitable, how local governments raise their revenues, and where affordable housing is located. Then we might have a prayer of changing the basic way that our metropolis is heading. If you'd like to learn more about this argument, as well as have some spicy additions of the narrative that are enriched by poetry from Detroit-based poets, song lyrics from Detroit-based songwriters, photography, and oral history, this is the book for you. And Liz is going to pass around, it's at the end, or now, a flyer which has at the bottom a discount coupon that you can use to order a hard or softbound copy of this book directly from the University of Pennsylvania Press at a 20% discount. And let me leave you with this. Listen to the first verse with a different kind of ear, please. Just a little bit. That's all we need in Detroit. Thank you very much. Love to take your questions. Sure. Please.
In this map, one of the things that was changing very stood out to me wasn't necessarily change from black to white to black was very bad. But it's the growth of the Hispanic area and what looks like an Asian region. How are they just becoming another set of segregated people within this larger area, or is there something how that sort of dimension starting to change, or is it changing?
So, Rich, you're referring to this situation in 2010. This is new for Detroit because until relatively recently, the city was just an overwhelmingly black-white story, as the maps for many decades showed. The latest census suggests that the city of Detroit is roughly 85% African American, maybe 8% Latino, a couple of percent of Asian, primarily Bangladeshi, in that neighborhood, the orange-colored one, and the residual being white. What that meant is for decades, the power structure in the city of Detroit was completely black-dominated. And that led to a whole bunch of perverse reactions in terms of the politics that were played city versus suburbs, because the race card could easily be played given the demographic reality behind those things. This is all now likely to change because as of the beginning of 2013, well actually as the election of 2013, just this last November, we had for the first time since the early 20th century, ward-based elections for city council in Detroit. For over a century, it had been an at-large election. Now for the first time, we have, guess what, a Latina woman on city council. As well as, obviously, several black folks, but this ward-based representation is a whole new wrinkle. And we really don't know how that's going to play out in terms of the traditional patterns of segregation grids. The other new wrinkle that we have is that in November we elected a white mayor, the first one in 40 years. This also is, I think, a hopeful sign because this guy, I think, legitimately was elected because he was known as a corporate turnaround artist. And the electorate saw beyond race, saw beyond identity politics to vote for somebody who was more competent to do the job that was needed in the city of Detroit. So I think we're at the edge of a somewhat change of regime, but I don't exactly know how it's going to work out. So I can't answer your question very well. My crystal ball's a little foggy on that. Please.
So some aspects of Detroit remind me of another area of the country of which I'm rather familiar. That's the St. Louis area, where auto industry, do you think so much differentiated Detroit from St. Louis? Not that St. Louis is just doing, it's not all, rose-colored glasses, but it's not in the same situation as Detroit, obviously, at this moment.
Right. You raise a very good point, and that is that people can look at other metropolitan areas with which they are familiar and see something that is very similar to Detroit in one dimension. And absolutely, I'm not trying to suggest that these forces that I've talked about are unique to Detroit. Clearly, they're not. Other cities have had race and class tensions. Oh, really? Other cities have had deindustrialization. Other cities are politically fragmented. What I'm trying to suggest is that all of those dimensions in Metro Detroit are almost at an extreme value.
They're on steroids.
Yeah, we really pumped up each one of those dimensions and then put them all together. And so we're kind of the hyper everything. And so other people sure have things that are going in one of our dimensions in the same direction, but I think we could offer, if you will, a cautionary tale of what happens if you pump too much steroids into these various dimensions all at the same time. Yes, please.
Fantastic, thank you. I'm wondering, I've been reading recently about a couple areas, Detroit, like Corktown and Midtown, where you have sort of, they've already sort of gentrified, I don't know if you want to use that term, but like racially, you've got a little white people coming in, and then now you have more white people coming in, displace the ones who are already there. And so there's not enough actual housing for these people. Like there's a kind of an inflated market in very specific areas of Detroit, which is also a depopulated and depopulating city.
Mm-hmm.
So if you've got these two very opposed forces very close to each other, do you think that there's something good that's going to be coming out of this for the city as a whole?
Terrific question. The areas that the questioner referred to are areas that essentially abut Woodward Avenue. This line that starts here and goes northwest is Woodward Avenue, the spine of the metropolitan area. It goes for 23 straight miles right up into the suburbs. Detroit is built on the featureless plain, after all. And the area that is being revitalized with new construction, rehabilitation, people moving in, new retail coming in, most of the folks being hipster whites, all the kind of stereotypes you think about when you think about gentrification, is in an upside down T pattern. The bottom of the T spreads along the river a little bit and then goes up Woodward, about a couple of miles, basically just about to Wayne State University in the Midtown area. Corktown is down here. So that area indeed has all of those things going on. And that's where a lot of news reports come from. And they say, oh my God, Detroit now has a Whole Foods store in the city limits. We do have one now. So woohoo, we're coming back. We have a Starbucks now. Woohoo, we're coming. All of that is a reality. The area in question is about 7 square miles. That city is 139 square miles. So we have this very odd circumstance of this little piece of the city growing in population, growing in disposable income. Sure, that would be great. Let's generalize it. Unfortunately, the rest of the 132 square miles are emptying out like a sieve. So it's a weird city. I use the metaphor of a bathtub. Yeah, the faucet is open. New stuff is flowing into the tub. But this big drain's open and the water level is still going down, 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 down. So it's a dual city. Which city do you want to look at? There are two realities here. But it's a fascinating place to be because many of the predominantly black population that live outside of that upside down T of 7 square miles thinks that the wave of gentrification is coming next to get them. They literally are living in fear of the white gentrifiers coming. I don't understand where they're getting that message. They must be reading the New York Times a lot or something. It's bizarre, but they believe it, and the politics of that can be very perverse, like that quote I suggested, that the white folks are coming to take the city back from us. Please.
George, terrific presentation.
Thank
Although
you.
you need to express your opinion more directly, we quite understand.
I know I've been very diplomatic, haven't I? Yes,
Uh,
using that veiled language.
Right. I want to talk, ask you about the employment. You've not said very much about the distribution of employment, but to get started, I did within the last month of a campaign to try to attract immigrants to Detroit. And I wondered, is this a realistic proposal? Is it serious? But if I could lead in, I remember 15 years ago when a lot of studies were done about the economic integration of center cities and suburban areas, whether or not metropolitan areas, suburbs and center city were in the same boat, or whether there was separation. And if I'm not mistaken, Detroit was one of the extreme cases of not doing linkages. And so I'm wondering kind of about that, if the community patterns, whereas the employment in the center city or the suburb and vice versa.
Yes. Okay, let me start with the employment morphology of the region. Yes, by most indices, Detroit has the most decentralized employment base of major American metropolitan areas. It's part of that donut pattern. It's not just residential, it's jobs as well. And that was led by the auto industry, who after World War II found that their old plants that had been built in the city limits in the first couple of decades of the 20th century were completely worn out by the end of World War II. And they wanted to build new plants, but the technology had changed. Multi-story plants were inefficient. Big one-story, big footprint plants were the rage. And so where are you going to find big chunks of land? Outside the city limits. So in the first decade after World War II, the Big Three built 24 new factories in southeast Michigan, 0 within the city limits. So at the same time, the Federal Housing Administration, of course, was pumping out a lot of incentives for white folks to buy their first homes. That was nationwide. So in Detroit, you had white folks saying, wow, I could get a new home in the suburbs and be closer to work at the same time? Bye. So that's one big decentralizing force due particularly to the technology of our economic base. If we were based on fire insurance and real estate, we'd be agglomerating in the core in high-rise office buildings. We never had that as part of our industrial base. Chicago had that, New York had it, we never did. So our office market is comparatively weak. The downtown's quote-unquote central business district is in fact the third largest office complex in the region. 2 suburban edge cities far outstrip the office capacity of our downtown. So we are this very much decentralized pattern. What about an attempt to reverse that? Yes, Governor Snyder had a trial balloon proposal to try to get a special set-aside of federal visas of high-worth, high-job-creating immigrants to come to Michigan, and somehow he's got an idea that we can force them to live within the city of Detroit. That little detail I haven't heard worked out very well. Now it's clear that a lot of other cities have had a much greater immigration than Detroit. In the book I show a chart actually of the percentage foreign-born in Detroit versus other metro areas. At the turn of the 20th century, we were right up there with New York in terms of share of foreign-born. Now we are way at the bottom of major metropolitan areas. Hell's bells, Atlanta has a lot higher percentage foreign-born than Metro Detroit. We have not attracted immigrants very well for the last half a century. And so that's been trying to be reversed, but it's a hard slog given our international reputation. My hope for policy, to anticipate your next question, was noticeably quiet on the employment front and economic development front. That was the reason. Because right now I think that given all those other rules of the game of where residential and other kinds of economic development is so incentivized to go to the suburbs, given the financial struggles of the city of Detroit, that the quality of life is such that the city of Detroit cannot reasonably expect very many people to choose that as their place to live, work, and do business. You got to be a crazy person like me to voluntarily live in the city of Detroit. I pay a huge economic penalty for doing that. And lots of other folks, especially if they have kids, and have to think about public schools, just can't make that happen. And I can't blame them. But my hope is that by changing those rules, those location decisions for households and firms will start to change. And maybe we'll get the situation where, through agglomeration, and maybe starting in this upside-down T in Midtown, we will get creative entrepreneurs coming to live and work and maybe become the next new Henry Ford of the 21st century and start Detroit on a new economic development path. I think that's our only hope. We can't keep chasing factories with subsidies. That has clearly failed for us. But the ability to attract, create, and retain entrepreneurial talent is our huge challenge right now. And with the dysfunctional metro area, we are losing that competition to the Research Triangles and the Austins and the Portlands of the world. Next. Yes, sir.
For the growth.
Ma'am, sorry, my eyes are bad.
For the growth boundary that you're proposing, are you thinking that the mechanism might best be a stick or a carrot?
A who or a what?
Stick or carrot?
Stick or carrot, thank you. Wow. If I were emperor, I wouldn't care. I would just order it be done. The real political challenge of that, I haven't really thought through, so I don't have a good answer for that. I suspect that the carrots would have to be incredibly powerful to get vested interest to do it. But the challenge to get this through Lansing is not just the fact that we have both houses of our legislature Republican dominated and a Republican governor, but the majority Democrats in the city of Detroit probably would not support my policy changes either. Because frankly, a lot of them see their vested political interest in keeping the status quo pretty much the same way it is. They often lead the charge of paranoia about white suburbanites taking over the city. And if we change the rules of the game to try to incentivize people with disposable income, a lot of them white, moving back into the city of Detroit, and incentivize affordable housing, many occupied by poor and black, going to the suburbs, they're seeing a real political challenge, downside to that kind of change. And frankly, I'm not sure how much support I would get in Lansing from my own state representative as a result of that. So I don't know whether it's carrots or sticks or if I'm just smoking something illegal to think about this. Peter?
So you have a whole cohort of folks that are 35 and under who have never seen anything but Detroit as a complete desolate wasteland. And the theory goes that those folks have a completely different view of urbanism and want to move back into Detroit and want to stick it to their parents by saying, I'm going to Detroit. The theory is, all you got to do is wait 20 years and wait for all the racism to die. Literally. For all the 50, 60, 70, and 80-year-olds to die. And you have a new group of people who are going to fundamentally change. Good theory, bad theory.
I think there are people who fit the description. Many are your colleagues. Many are my current students. God bless them. They are moving to Detroit against all rationality in some cases. Yes, and they are making a difference. There is no doubt that they are changing the character of several neighborhoods in the region that a previous questioner had talked about. Can that generalize to save the whole city of Detroit and change the morphology of the entire region? I don't think so. My analysis is that there's so many rules of the game that are tilting the playing field away from the city financially and in terms of location of economic and residential activity, that just doing the right thing or having a particular set of values can't be counted on for enough people to change the tide. It's a cynical view, I will confess, but that's where I'm coming from.
So it sounds like your prognosis is not that great for Detroit.
Yes, now you're asking that question that I asked you to ask. Yes, this is a project that has taken the last 10 years of my life. And it has been a very personal project because it's a place I care deeply about. For God's sakes, there was a street named after my great-great-grandfather in this city. Of course I care about it. But the more I thought about it and analyzed it, the more pessimistic I became. Now, having said that, I think the rules of the game are so skewed against Detroit that its long-term prospects are very dim. That's not to say that there aren't glimmers of hope. And I want to, by all means, mention those. There are a serious group of committed people who really want Detroit to succeed. Detroit is full of incredible, committed, high-energy people, black and white, who I've never seen any place else so committed to a place, sometimes against all reason. There are community organizations which are very strong and are doing a lot of good to improve the quality of life of individuals against overwhelming odds. For the first time in a long time in this budget coming out of Lansing, the governor proposed a 3% increase in state revenue sharing to cities. Now, it's a drop in the bucket, but at least it's going in the right direction. We have an interesting player in Detroit by the name of Dan Gilbert, a multi-billionaire who now owns, I think, 40-some buildings in the core of our city and is trying to build Gilbertville, a privatized city within the city with working areas, living areas, work-live places, entrepreneurial incubators, private security, securing sidewalks and formerly public parks. It's a fascinating thing that's going on. Whether that can turn around and generate enough activity in one part of the city that there's actually some positive spillover effects is anybody's guess. And who is going to benefit from that is anybody's guess, but that's a very cautiously optimistic sign of what's going on in Detroit right now. And so it's definitely a place worth watching, although I think how we get out of this financial crisis is going to have a lot to do with our future. If there's lots of deals afloat of foundation money being matched with state money to pay off part of this debt and to leave the pensioners with some money as opposed to throwing them into poverty, which would be a huge blow to our metropolitan area. How that shakes out is going to have a lot to throw the needle of optimism or pessimism in the next year one way or the other. And I don't have an inside knowledge of how that's going to shake out. So there's a lot of huge question marks that could go either way in the next couple of years in Detroit. Stay tuned.
Can you talk more about the Hispanic immigrant community there and, who are they? I mean, I remember in the 80s, a lot of people were talking about areas of New York City that were sort of being brought back by immigration, the subway system being supported by it, and all these other things. What's the story here?
Well, I can say for sure that they're not supporting our subway system. Detroit is the only major metropolitan in the United States with 0 miles of fixed rail transit above or below ground. But the immigrant population to southwest Detroit, as I mentioned, primarily from Mexico, is indeed a major demographic shift. You may recall the time-lapse photography. They started from a small little census tract to now a dominant force in the southwest part of the city. This section of the city is the only section between 2000 and 2010 that actually grew in population. So they really are densifying a part of the city which is otherwise de-densifying it at a huge rate. And they are bringing with them a lot of commercial and retail viability, especially along the major Spine Street burner. So there is a real live sense of community there with taquerias and all sorts of stuff happening that makes it a lively part of town, and even tourists from the suburbs come into Mexican town all the time to sample the margaritas and tacos. So it's a definitely growing part of town. There are very few highly skilled, highly paid workers in this part of town. So there's not a great deal of disposable income, but it's interesting to see what's going to happen with it, especially now that they have for the first time their own voice on city council. It is definitely an indicator of how concentrated, spatially intense immigration can turn around a direction of neighborhood change, which is so clearly visible in most of the rest of the city. But again, incentivizing that to happen more is what seems to be very difficult.
Do they own homes?
Yeah, at a reasonable rate. I can't quote you the ownership rates. Peter, do you know, by any chance, the ownership rates in Southwest? Aren't they about half, I would guess?
They're right around 45 to 50%, or at least they were. It's a duality of second and third generation Mexican immigrants, jobs in the Southwest, were able to save money and could go to Detroit, move up from restaurant service or landscaping, get a job in a factory. And as they've established that, it's now become a direct conduit for first generation immigrants coming in. So there's a duality of established families that own a significant chunk of property and rent to first generations.
But it was kind of driven by factory jobs, which are
Some of it was. Some of it was. But
Thank you.
Mexican town, to be fair to Detroit, Detroit has Pole Town, Greek Town, Cork Town, Hungarian Village, German Town. So calling it Mexican Town is pretty much a tradition. If you're a minority, you get a town, a village, or a city or a block named after you.
Absolutely. Thank you.
So how do you counter this mythology, this narrative out there in the world that the whole problem with Detroit was, that those pensions that city employees had? I teach public financial management, talked about this in my class in the fall, that, look, the city lost its tax base, okay? But the whole narrative, this mythology out there is, oh no, it's just that the pensions were too costly.
Yeah, the city unions were too powerful, and they extracted these outrageous pensions from the poor citizens of Detroit that they can't possibly afford to pay. Those outrageous pensions right now run on average $20,000 a year.
Yeah.
That's what
And
we're talking
nobody
about.
talks about
Poverty
those
level
tax
pensions. Poverty level pensions were so horrifically extracted, for being a cop for 30 years. Oh, right. I mean, it's a nonsense narrative, for starters.
Counter it. How do you get traction on a different narrative?
Well, that's a great
Because
question.
to change the rules, you've got to
Right.
get people to pay attention to the reality versus this mythology, this
Right.
narrative.
Well, if you,
I would argue
please.
the challenge for Detroit is it's everybody's narrative. Because if you listen to talk radio,
Right.
they voted Democrat. That's the problem.
Mhm.
Kentucky right now, or Tennessee, there are groups running around with photos of Detroit on billboards encouraging VW employees not to unionize
Right.
because it's the UAW's fault.
Mhm.
So it has become a whiteboard where every person who has a pet theory
Mhm.
puts it up there.
Mhm.
And because it is such a playground of disinvestment,
Right.
every one of those theories sticks. So it isn't so much that there's one wrong narrative, there's 100 narratives and none of them go anywhere below the surface.
Right.
but we're the evidence to support all of these crackpot theories. Yeah, it's great to be evidence for these, isn't it? I mean, I tried to show
Yeah, no,
as
it's
succinctly as I could an alternative narrative that the rules of the game that the state set in place
Right.
basically gave Detroit no chance. And then
Right.
the auto industry started with the industrial tax base flight. So a combination of technology and big corporate decisions and state rules of the game gave Detroit very little chance to avoid this downward financial spiral.
Yeah, and your presentation was fabulous and brought together the pieces. So everybody needs to buy the book and get the narrative out there.
I tried to get it out there, it's very, very difficult.
No, I know it is difficult.
I've talked to the governor's urban policy guy one-on-one. I've shown him some of these slides and he nods, and I've talked to my state senator. I've been on the radio and done op-eds, and
And you're trying to counter that he doesn't mean all the pensions. Yeah.
there's-
It's sort of a simplistic question, I hope. Recently with everything going on with the DIA, things that might be sold, you see some of the suburbanites realizing that maybe Detroit has some things that are still good. It has the Red Wings, it has Tigers, it has DIA, maybe it has some things that are good. I'm wondering if there might be a chance or for that narrative to maybe change, that Detroit isn't the cause of all of our problems, that it's the reason those people live there. It's the reason that people live in the suburbs, because something was attracted to the city that came there that then brought them or their ancestors or whatever. And one issue that I see is you have the mayor, but then you have like the county executive. And so you have these two different people who both hold a lot of power, but for very different constituencies. And I think they've been traditionally sort of, zero-sum game for them as well. They don't both win, one has to. I mean, do you see that there's a chance in the future for them to work together or for something to change?
There are some hopeful signs. Can I give some of my hopeful signs, and then you can throw some cold water on my... Couple of hopeful signs. And in 2005, there was a regional ballot issue to give a little surcharge on everyone's property tax bill of maybe $60 or so a year for the average home that would go into a region-wide fund and then would be distributed by some formula to the various arts organizations. Now, the word was out that most of those institutions that would get the money would be located in the city of Detroit. So Wayne County, the home city of Detroit, voted for that. The 2 suburban counties voted against it. It failed. A version of that was upped again, and in 2012, I think, they voted in favor of a region-wide levy on everybody to support the DIA. And that raises a considerable amount of taxpayer money for the region to support what is essentially a city-owned organization. Now, they're talking now about spinning it off to a nonprofit. But that's an encouraging sign that at least the region realizes that it's a regional asset that they all get some benefit from. A classic non-zero-sum thinking about that. So that's good. Brooks Patterson, the executive of Oakland County, who for years has been playing the zero-sum game race card as well as anybody, who has been quoted as saying he loves sprawl. Oakland County depends on sprawl. He wants that sprawl as best as he can get it. That guy is eventually going to die. I think he's 75 now. And maybe the replacement will be of the new guard that Peter talked about and not base his political career on bashing Detroit. So there's my hope that things maybe will shift a little bit. Peter, did you want to?
I was just going to say the nuance is that Detroit occupies about 60% of Wayne County. So even though you have places like Grosse Pointe with extreme wealth, the Wayne County executive and the Detroit mayor have to work together, and they have traditionally worked together. It's the other county executives that run along 8 Mile across the top that are the ones literally talking about fence off, throw blankets and corn, treat it like an Indian reservation. A literal quote from what, 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago?
Yeah, in the New Yorker. There's a wonderful portrait of Brooks Patterson. Wonderful, terrible portrait of Brooks Patterson. We have lots of great politicians.
Accurate.
Yeah. Other questions or comments? Can I ask you a question? A little unusual, but is there any resonance with any of the issues that I talked about here in Austin? Or is this just another world?
I was just going to do a little calculation. I think in our metropolitan area, if I'm not mistaken, we have 90 to 100 governments. And so if we double that, try to get up to your size, the number of governments you have is not all that different from what we have here locally.
Okay.
In Houston metropolitan area, is something like 400 local governments. So that resonates. That
Okay.
seems very familiar.
And school districts, oh my goodness, we've had so many school
Yeah, but
districts.
one of the things Fritz and I were talking about is that in Texas, a lot of this has to do with how easy it is to annex and how easy it is to incorporate. And you always know what you know from where you grew up and don't necessarily know what it is in different states. In Texas, it's very easy to annex and relatively difficult to incorporate. So there's not a lot of new cities in Texas. But all the trends you talked about, somebody said on steroids, all the trends you talk about are seen in cities everywhere, in the United States anyway. It's just that I've never seen such an avalanche of everything coming together in a horrible sort of, and I think some of it has to be the auto industry, the dependence on just one industry.
And that's why I brought up St. Louis, I'm so familiar with. Significant loss of tax base, of racial and class
Sure.
differentiation of flight and suburbs of all these separate places. If you talked about Austin, I would say that affordable housing is a huge issue and challenge for us here. And we are having a growing disparity in it is a different world. I mean, to look at Detroit and Austin, I can kind of look at Detroit and St. Louis, but.
Back here, you had some.
I would say politically, I think there's almost an inverse. I think, and like Felicity, this year switching to single-member district council election. I didn't realize Detroit was almost the exact same thing. And the campaign for that was that the central city was dominating the politics of City Hall too much. And I mean, I'm biased when it's looking at City. I don't think it was that job. It's very environment with a strong environmental streak and all that. But that, so from that angle, I think it seems to be almost inverse because we have a strong central area, and I think Austin's done well because of it.
Yeah, the 10-1 that we have now, that the city have had, I don't know how many votes about over the years, whether it goes single member districts. They just passed the 10-1 did. And yes, there was a feeling that a core of inner city, urban, liberal elites control City Hall and all of the elected all the council.
They do.
And I would say, and if you look, I'm getting that, and if you looked at the zip codes, they were all from just, a couple of zip codes. So, 10-1, the 10-1 passed, and we'll say that doesn't affect the first city council election will be November. 10-1, but yeah, we can do the zip code.
Texas reminds me of growing up in Ohio in the 50s because everything was growing. The whole mindset was it's always going to be this way. So there's not, it's a psychological thing that Texas has this notion that it's going to continue this way forever just because God has blessed Texas. But, God blessed Ohio in the 50s and, it changed pretty dramatically. Not quite as dramatic as Detroit. But there's a lot of similarities.
Thank you. Liz?
It'll be another time.
I'm sorry.
Thanks.
Thank you.